All right, last big lecture for the U.S. history curriculum here. Into the 2000s with President Bush and President Obama as I play with my Zoom and with the tripod. Try to make it as good as possible. All right, this will definitely be a two-parter. Lots of info, lots of slides to go through and stuff like that. But we're finally going to talk about some presidents that you students have lived through. You were all born during the Bush administration, I believe. Maybe a couple. Nope. Yeah, all born during the Bush administration. So you've lived through Bush, you lived through Obama. All right, so 2000 election, right? We just talked about Clinton last time, or 2 times ago, right? Because I did the War on Terror. So Clinton is up in 2000. He got elected in 92 and 96. So we have a 2000 election. We got Al Gore and Joe Lieberman running as the Democratic ticket. Al Gore had been vice president for 8 years. Versus George Bush and Dick Cheney on the Republican ticket. Okay, this will end up being a very, very, very controversial election. And I would argue it does not matter, particularly what your politics are. It was not good what ends up happening with the Supreme Court because it could open it up for worse Supreme Court decisions in the future, or at least I should say by that improper Supreme Court involvement in things in the future. So, experience, Gore had been Clinton's VP for 8 years, Joe Lieberman a long-time senator. Bush had been governor of Texas, and Dick Cheney had been working around Washington, D.C. forever as Secretary of Defense for the first Bush administration and for National Security Advisor for other administrations and stuff like that. In the end, Al Gore is going to win the popular vote, and the election will come down to the state of Florida because we need to know here in America, the popular vote does not equal the presidency. Have to win the Electoral College. The reason they did that was because our founding fathers didn't trust the population, the regular folk, to make those kinds of decisions, which sucks. There's a lot of arguments about whether or not the Electoral College should be around or not, and we'll sidestep that right now, but that's our system, right? So the popular vote doesn't equal presidency. We've had a lot of popular vote losers win presidencies recently, right? In 2000, Al Gore wins the popular vote, but George Bush will be a minority president, will get less than half of the vote, but become president. Same thing just happened with President Trump. So, anyways, the vote was so close in the state of Florida that a recount was triggered. Initially, news reports had said that Bush had won and had won the election, but it was so close that automatically a recount happened. So most states, I should say, never mind, every state has their own rules on recounts, okay? In some states, you have to petition for it, you have to ask for it. In some states, if it's within a certain percentage, like 0.5%, then you must do a recount, and that's how it is in Florida. So this was automatic, right? Side note to this, perhaps not the most fair of things here, President George Bush's brother Jeb was the governor of Florida and eventually orders the recounts to be halted. There will be a Supreme Court challenge, right, by the Al Gore campaign. Eventually the Supreme Court decides to stop the recounts, which is not good. And here's why I will say that. It's not because I didn't like President Bush, because I really didn't. But I wouldn't have liked President Al Gore either, knowing his politics as well as I do as well. But the Supreme Court shouldn't be involved in this. It makes no sense at all. It's a huge overreach by the Supreme Court. They have nothing to do with this, right? The state had its own laws. The laws were being followed. They should have just done the recount. The Supreme Court stepping in and in a 5-4 split decision, a bunch of conservative justices who call themselves originalists, who prescribe or say that they follow the Constitution by the letter, did something that's not in the Constitution at all. It's a whole bunch of legal worms, a can of legal worms that they opened up with this Supreme Court decision. And that just opens up for the Supreme Court to get involved in other presidential election counts or election things, more so than we would like, I think. But through it all, George W. Bush gets declared the winner in the closest election in modern American history. The end vote count was 537 more for George Bush. There's been subsequent studies done on the recount. Most of them say that Al Gore probably would have won the recount, although it's very, very close and it doesn't matter in the long run anyways. So, in the end, President Bush wins. George Bush wins with 271 electoral votes. Al Gore gets 266. To win the presidency, you have to get 271 electoral votes. So, just barely. That's how close it is. 271 to 266. That's pretty crazy, right? So, here's the breakdown on the map. The big states that helped decide this one: Florida with 26 electoral votes, Ohio with 21. Those are the big swing states in this election. So that's how it looked. Look at our state, Colorado. This might be the last time that we voted as a state for a Republican, but we'll see on the next election map. So true or false? Bush-Gore 2000 was the closest modern election in American history. Is that true or is that false? So there he is right there, George Walker Bush, 43rd president, son of the 41st president. So, just like his dad, he's born super rich and super well connected in the state of Connecticut. He will move to Texas with his father when his father starts in the oil business. So now George W. will grow up both rich anyways, but well connected in politics and business. So his father was the 41st president. This is the second time we've ever had a father-son presidential duo, but it's the first time since the 1800s with John Adams and John Quincy Adams. George W. Bush will go to Yale and to Harvard, where he'll eventually get an MBA. There's a lot of questions about how he got into Yale. That part of it is what we call a legacy admission. I don't have any access to his test scores, but it gives me an opportunity to bring this up. We do have affirmative action for rich people, basically. And those are legacy admissions. So if my father had gone to Yale and I applied to Yale, I would get extra points on my application because my father had gone to Yale. So George W. Bush's grandfather and father had gone to Yale, so it gives him an easier path. Now, I don't know his whole test results and all that sort of stuff, so we don't need to get into that, but it's a good way for me to bring up that we do have programs that benefit that sort of class of people. Anyways, he'll get into the oil business, of course, because his family was in the oil business. He eventually becomes the majority owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. Then he'll become governor of Texas from 1995 to 2000, and then he will win the presidential election. He will have to sell his ownership stake in the Rangers. I'm not sure if he did it while he was governor, but he definitely did it before he became president, because we used to make presidents divest from their businesses. So on the left, there's President Bush throwing out the first pitch for the Rangers. Next to him is his father. On the right, there is President Bush and his wife, Laura. Laura Bush, right? I believe it's Laura Bush. So what electoral experience did George W. Bush have before he became president? Was it A, governor of Texas, B, congressman from Texas, C, senator from Texas, or D, mayor of Dallas, Texas? All right, so to his domestic policies. His presidency has largely been defined and remembered by huge events, disasters, attacks, and wars, and his response to them, which in my opinion, and I feel like probably in most people's opinions at this point, if you look at the polling, right, he left very unpopular. Most Americans didn't believe that he did a great job, although his image is being a little bit rehabbed, which every president tries to do after they leave. But if you remember the 2016 presidential election, now President Trump, candidate Trump, spent most of his time bashing Bush's policies, especially the war in Iraq, and so did Hillary Clinton. So both sides were bashing him pretty good. Anyways, he believed in what they called compassionate conservatism, which means using a small government and free market principles to accomplish social good. Through that, they will create the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, because he thought that faith-based and private charities were more effective than the government intervention. Now, that's not accurate. One prime example I always like to use, here in America right now, we got about 1 in 6 children that are hungry, 1 in 10 total people that are hungry. The last time that we ended food insecurity in America was in the 70s under Nixon with the big government program. We then broke up that big government program into small, and funneled it mostly through churches and private food kitchens and stuff like that, and we see more people hungry now than before. The compassionate conservatism thing, what always gets me is that people will say things like the free market will accomplish social good. The free market has no feelings, has no emotions, it has no morality. It is literally just the market that we buy and sell goods, right? So that itself does not promote social good, right? You have to push social good into the market. But I digress. So anyways, they did this. I believe that office is still around. We do love to funnel things. It's not just a Bush thing. It's not just a Republican thing. Even many liberals love private charities like the Gates Foundation and stuff like that. So much so that they're afraid to raise taxes on rich people because they're afraid that rich people won't give to those charities anymore. So that's kind of where we're at. President Bush will ban the use of federal funds for research using stem cells that could result in the death of human embryos. Only those that had been created before his presidency could be used. That was mainly on religious grounds that he didn't want to use those stem cells. So that kind of set back research a bunch because stem cell research is some of the most promising for curing diseases and treating diseases. So that'll be paused for about 8 years. And he'll pass a big education reform program called No Child Left Behind. This was bipartisan, and it was bad. It's not particularly good. We haven't had much good education policy out of Washington for many years. Both Democrats and Republicans really suck on education policy, at least in my opinion. So anyways, No Child Left Behind. It expands federal funding for education and set federal standards for school achievement and teacher accreditation. It will be controversial at some points. High standards, reliance on testing, cost, and the weakening of local autonomy in education. The part that gets controversial is it put up higher standards and set federal standards. That doesn't particularly bother me because I think in America we end up having pretty uneven education standards between different states, and especially on key things, like here we are in a U.S. history class. The Civil War gets taught completely differently in Alabama than it does, say, in New York. And it shouldn't be that different. But big issue with it is its reliance on testing, right? Formal testing, you fill in bubbles and that sort of thing, isn't an accurate representation of how smart you are. There's a whole lot of other things that could go into that. But through No Child Left Behind, if you wanted that extra funding, you had to give these tests. You had to give more tests, extra tests, compare those tests. My first year teaching in Utah, I taught math. I had to give 10 state benchmark tests that were ran along the lines of the federal benchmark testing, 10 extra tests. So just too much stuff. One other thing that they will do is they'll propose more funding to be siphoned out of public schools, taken away from public schools and given to private and charter schools, which sucks. Absolutely sucks. And it's not just a Bush thing. I'd love to say it was just Bush and he was just one bad guy who did this, but President Obama will build off of this and he'll funnel more money to charter schools out of the public school budget. There's no reason for that. Just give more money to public schools, right? We don't need charter schools. We don't need private schools. We need better public schools, which is fine. Just give us the money and we'll get better. But maybe that's clouded by the fact that I work at a public school. I don't know. So there he is signing No Child Left Behind. Around him, you've got Democrat and Republican lawmakers. Like I said, it was a bipartisan solution, I suppose, or a bipartisan effort. You can see here on the right, there's a cartoon. It says, "Is this the test to test us for the test to see if we are ready for the test?" That's kind of how it felt, right? So immediately there was an aim to fix No Child Left Behind, and we'll talk about Race to the Top, which was the Obama era education reform bill, which also sucked, but we'll get there. So what was President Bush's landmark education program called? Was it A, Race to the Top, B, the Comprehensive Children's Education Program, C, No Child Left Behind, or D, none of the above? All right, so domestic policies. I'm not going to spend much time on the 2004 election. He will win the popular vote that time. He wins re-election over Democrat John Kerry, 286 to 251. Generally, what comes out of that, the big thing that people talk about, I mean, Bush was not a very popular president, but John Kerry himself wasn't a very popular candidate. So the Democrats, again, not choosing someone that's super competitive, which I worry they're doing again and again and again, but I digress. The Swift boat thing is what we end up getting out of this. Okay, so John Kerry was a decorated war hero in Vietnam. He was a captain of a boat, and he did all this stuff, or maybe he was a captain of a helicopter, one of the two. And he won some medals, but he got disillusioned with the war, so he came back and he protested the war afterwards, including throwing some of his medals over the White House wall into the White House yard. And then there'll be a lot of campaigns against him when he runs for president. Because of that, they call him un-American and all this stuff. So then he tried to overemphasize his military service, and it didn't seem all that genuine. So President Bush wins re-election, right? So 286 to 251, another close one. It wasn't a blowout. We don't really have blowouts anymore. So Medicare and Social Security reforms under Bush. He believed in an ownership society, right? So by that he means your life, you own it. Everything is in your hands, right? Which to an extent everybody agrees with. But in America, we tend to forget that where you are born, when you are born, who you are born to, what connections your family has, makes a huge difference in what kind of society you can own, what kind of life that you can own, and we don't ever like to really talk about those things. Again, I will say this is not just a Republican thing. We talked about this with Clinton. Clinton was huge on the ownership society. He was huge on cutting social safety net programs and saying, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever. So, anyways. He wanted to stop short of a big program like the Affordable Care Act, or what he wanted was to have more health savings accounts, HSAs. You can talk to your folks about that. Some places offer those. So he'll eventually sign the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, which actually created new benefits and competition within the system. Although when we say competition in the Medicare system, that means allowing, we have all these different things like Medicare Part D, C, E, F, G, there's a bunch of them that allow private companies into the Medicare system, which might not always be good. Anyways, it was the largest expansion of Medicare benefits since 1965. Big goal for him was to privatize Social Security, right? So you get a lot of people talking about whether or not Social Security is going to survive. A lot of that is manufactured. A lot of that is the fact that we don't want to raise taxes on anybody, but we want to keep spending on all the things we spend on, so we steal money from the Social Security fund. Those things can be fixed. There's a cap where we tax people only up to $250,000 of their income for Social Security. If we lifted that cap to $1 million, Social Security would last another 70 years, which means it's fine, it's solvent, it's okay. It'll be okay if they will have the guts in Washington to make a couple of those decisions. But a lot of people, and this goes back all the way to the 60s, wanted to privatize Social Security. Instead of the government overseeing it, you invest on your own, right? And they kind of mandate that you're investing this stuff. It would allow some people to divert their contributions into private accounts, which would mean two things, right? Number one, if you're doing it privately, that means that there will be fees attached because you have to go through a brokerage firm, so it's going to make a lot of stockbrokers rich. And secondly, if young people like you or I were diverting our Social Security income, our contributions into private accounts, that means that old people retiring now, like my parents, might not have enough money, the Social Security program might not have enough money to pay out those people that are retiring. In the end, he will fail to reform it, much like President Clinton failed to reform it. President Obama will even take a bit of a stab at privatizing it, and it won't pass either. Big reason for that is that everybody loves Social Security. People want that check, that security, when they get old. It's one of the most popular programs in the country. So both parties are incentivized to not let it fail, or not to do things that people don't like, which I guess privatizing might fit into there. All right, big important moment for President Bush, right? We're going to get to, I'm not going to skip over terrorism and war and all that stuff. We will get to that here in a second, but that's going to have its own section. Big domestic thing, probably the biggest failure of President Bush's presidency, at least inside the borders of America, will be Hurricane Katrina. August 29th of 2005, a huge hurricane will strike New Orleans. 80% of the city of New Orleans was flooded. There was a voluntary evacuation order that had been issued by the state of Louisiana, but it was mostly ignored because the year before that, they had a huge evacuation order warning people about a super deadly hurricane that turned out not to be all that deadly. A lot of people got stranded on the highway, and it was this huge disaster. So a lot of people just ignored the evacuation order the next year. FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration that we have, the state and federal response was completely, totally pathetic, right? This isn't just President Bush's mistake. He did really, really bad, and he's president, and presidents get blamed when they do bad things, handling crises. But he's not the only one that screwed up, right? So he screwed up. The guy he put in charge of FEMA was a moron, and the only reason he put him in charge is because he contributed a bunch of money to Bush's campaigns and to the Republican Party. The state of Louisiana's response was pathetic. The governor was awful. The mayor of New Orleans was awful. It was everybody. It ends up involving a lot of different political parties and a lot of people. Ultimately, though, we can lay a lot of blame at President Bush because the stroke of a pen, right? The president can open up all sorts of aid and do all sorts of things to help people, and he waited and waited and waited. People were stuck on their roofs for days. Literally, people were living on their roofs because the rest of their house was flooded. There wasn't enough food or shelter for the displaced. Crime will run rampant. There'll be many accusations of people looting. There'll be many accusations of police brutality. There'll be accusations of modern-day lynching and stuff like that throughout the city. This will be a huge failure, a huge, huge, huge failure, and there's no way to whitewash that. That's why you see with every other president They'll say, is this President Obama's Katrina? Is this President Bush's Katrina? And there'll be more and more of that. And when they're saying that, they're saying, is this the example of when the president gets faced with a crisis and does everything basically wrong? Next big thing that comes in a part of this, and it's something that we should understand, especially right now during the coronavirus pandemic, is that disaster capitalism comes into New Orleans. What that is when private companies see a disaster as an opportunity to gain huge profits, to swoop in, buy up public things, and make them private. Right? So, private companies are going to swoop into New Orleans and basically buy up all the public schools because the city was so in debt that they were struggling to keep schools open. So private companies will come in and buy them, turn them all into charter and private schools, and now there's no public school available in New Orleans, which eventually just screws over the people living there because they have to pay to go to these schools now. So that's an example. Similar sorts of things happening in Puerto Rico right now, same with education, but also with the electrical grid and energy production there. I'm worried that there'll be a push towards more privatization of education after the coronavirus stuff winds down as well. So there's Hurricane Katrina on a map sort of thing, in the picture, I should say a satellite photo. That's how big it was. I mean, look how gigantic that is. It's not the biggest hurricane ever recorded, but I think it's the biggest hurricane ever recorded to hit mainland America. So this is what New Orleans looked like with all the flooding. I would highly recommend, there's a Spike Lee documentary about it, but it's very long, but there's a lot of good documentaries on Katrina, or there's a lot of good, if you just go on YouTube and search Hurricane Katrina, you can watch just replays of the news from back then. You can see the devastation a little bit better than just these photos. But 80% of the city was flooded. There were flood waters up to 15, 20 feet, depending on where you were. Big part of that, which I don't have a good picture of for this, is that the city of New Orleans is actually below sea level. Right? So let me go to this one, up to here. So the city of New Orleans is on the coast there in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's actually below sea level, which means that if they did not build something, then the city would naturally flood. So what did? They built these things called levees. These levees are basically just big mounds of dirt that keep they stack it up above the height of the ocean and above, or I guess like the Bay of Mexico, or the bay right there. But if the levees break, right, if something floods over them and it displaces the dirt, right, or if there's a huge hurricane or something like that, then the city will flood, right? And so because with Hurricane Katrina, there were these huge waves, and the hurricane legit just went right through the levees and ripped them apart, that allows all this ocean water to get in, right? So, you can see here on the right, people being rescued from their roofs. On the left here, okay, actually all of it here, but in there, this dome-looking thing there, that's where the New Orleans Saints play football. It's the Astrodome. That's not the Astrodome. It's the Superdome, right? What am I doing? The Astrodome. That's in Texas. So, anyways, so they're supposed to go here, and that's where the disaster relief is going to be. There was not enough cots for people to sleep on. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough water. The sanitation system backed up. There was literally sewage backing up through the toilets and through the sinks and stuff in there. It ends up being a complete and total disaster. On the far left, you can see how bad the flooding was and the damage. In the middle is what it looks like, more so now, although it's probably a couple years old. Then on the right, you can see all the people outside being held out from going in, and all the garbage and all the stuff. It's just a complete nightmare. They couldn't have handled it any worse. So, how much of the city of New Orleans was flooded by Hurricane Katrina? 50, 60, 70, or 80%? A, B, C, or D? All right, the economy. The economy will get worse under President Bush, and not all of it is his fault, but a good amount of it is some of his policy ideas. So, in 2001, there will be a recession because the dot-com bubble burst, and that's not President Bush's fault necessarily. President Clinton was the president while the dot-com bubble inflated, but again, it's not always 100% his fault either, but there's a recession. So what do we do with the recession? President Bush proposes tax cuts. He said if we cut taxes, the economy will get stimulated, okay? Which means, basically, if we go all the way back to FDR followed a guy by the name of Keynes, and John Maynard Keynes said if people have money in their pocket, they will spend that money, and that will generate the economy to get going. So President Bush tries something kind of like that, 1.35 trillion in tax cuts. Taxes were cut across the board, lower through upper class. Of course, though, what's important to note is that when tax cuts aren't tapered, they help the rich more. So if I save 3% on my tax return, and Bill Gates saves 3% on his tax return, it is much, much different for both of us, right? And just like before, rich people took their tax cuts and saved it. They did not pass it down to the rest of us. 2003, there'll be another tax cut bill that will accelerate tax changes passed in the earlier tax cut. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group that evaluates what the economic impact will, how much money it'll cost us to do certain things, said that the tax cuts would not pay for themselves. They would add to the debt, they would increase our trade deficit, and it would cost our treasury between $1.7 and $2 trillion, which all ended up being accurate. Tax cuts were largely opposed by economists because cutting taxes during recession doesn't really work, but they tried it anyways. These tax cuts, as well as some changes to corporate law, will again help the rich much more than the poor. Income inequality will continue to get worse and worse and worse. Be real bad under Bush. I'll show you a chart here again in a minute. So true or false, the Bush tax cuts paid for themselves. Very few tax cuts pay for themselves. I showed you both of these charts with last time we were talking about Clinton, but here we are in the Bush administration. I'll walk up into here. Of all the average income growth during those years, 99% of all of the income growth, of all the new wealth generated, went to the top 10%. And the rest of us, the bottom 90, had to fight it out for 1%. See again here, here's where we're at, about right here, 2000 to the end of this, 2007. That's where the economy gets a little worse during the Bush administration, but you see, still ends up pretty darn good for the top 1%, right? They start at this time period worth about 1.5 million, and they end worth about 2 million each. Top 20% does okay under him. The rest of us stay exactly the same. So there's another president. Okay, we've gone through Reagan, we've gone through Clinton, and we went through Reagan, Bush, Clinton, now another Bush. We can see things get better for the rich and worse for the rest of us. I sense a pattern here. So, the tax cuts were not accompanied by any reduction in government spending, which means that our trade surplus would go away and the debt would increase by 101% during his presidency. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq would really drive up the debt, obviously, but we'll talk about them here in a second. The economy will grow and shrink sporadically during his presidency. So, important there, that first bullet point. We cut taxes, which means we cut how much money the government was bringing in, but we did not cut any spending. Okay? We didn't cut military spending, we didn't cut social spending, which means we're bringing in less money, but we're still spending the same amount, which means we go into debt and have to borrow more and more, right? 2008 financial crisis. Okay, again, this is not entirely President Bush's fault, but part of it is too, right? Because he's not the only one to deregulate the housing market and the commercial banking system. President Ford helped with that, so did President Reagan, or sorry, I should say Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton all helped deregulate it. So it's not just the second President Bush, but it's going to go crazy bad on his watch. So, late 2008, the last year of his presidency, or late 2007, the last full year of his presidency, the stock market is going to drop about 6,000 points. Well, it's a big decline in the stock market. So, they pass a $168 billion stimulus bill to try to shore up the economy. But things get worse, right? Deregulation of the housing market, the investment in commercial banking industry led to insanely awful lending practices. So literally, banks would deliberately give out mortgages to people they knew could not afford them. So they would find people and they'd say, hey, you make $30,000 a year, cool. Here's a loan for $500,000. Knowing that they could not afford the payments on those loans or whatever, but that didn't matter because they bundled all these bad mortgages into packages that they could sell in the stock market. How ridiculous is that? They made mortgages, they gave out loans they knew that people couldn't repay, right? So they're bad loans, they're bad financial things to have, but then they bundled up all these bad things, called them something different, and sold it on the stock market. Sounds like a bad idea, right? But we let it go on, okay? We deregulated, we said that they'll make sure that they do the right thing because they don't want their businesses to fail or blah, 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 blah. And everything collapses. So in September 2008, everything hits the fan. Multiple lending and banking companies will fail, go out of business overnight. Credit will seize up and unemployment will skyrocket. This will be the worst financial event in U.S. history since the Great Depression. although now the coronavirus outbreak will probably end up outpacing this. Government had learned, though, and will take more of a prominent role, but it will not take enough of a prominent role, I'll say, right? They'll jump in quicker, but they'll do less fixing of things or regulating things on the back end. So, the government took control of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are two of the quasi-government agencies that do a lot of FHA or Federal Housing Authority mortgage loans and stuff like that. They'll pay a huge bailout package at taxpayer expense and pass a huge stimulus package, $700 billion under Bush and then a larger one under President Obama. Worst part about all this, or maybe not the worst part, but one of the worst parts about this is that there was no real prosecution for any of the bankers who knowingly broke the law. There was barely any regulation increase, and banks have basically started doing all the same stuff over again because we didn't force them to change. We gave them money with no strings attached. They gave bonuses to their ownership and to their the people in charge of the company, the CEOs, the presidents of the company, and then fired a whole bunch of people, and then didn't reform their practices. So now we're seeing similar things starting to happen again. So we can see here, Wall Street Journal, U.S. draft sweeping plan to fight crisis. Michael Lewis wrote a book called The Big Short. There's a movie adaptation of it. I would highly recommend you watch that because it does a great job explaining it, and it's got a bunch of good actors in it, Christian Bale and Steve Carell and Ryan Gosling and Brad Pitt, and they go through and explain how exactly all of this happened. It will make you mad. It made me quite mad. So, deregulation of the housing market, of the investment and commercial banking industry led to insanely awful blanks, which once defaulted upon, led to the financial collapse of 2008. A, stock investments. B, lending practices. C, money ideas. Or D, bank expansions. All right, we're ready up to about the end of how long I can record one of these segments, so we'll stop here and continue on in a moment.